Sound of tires crunching against gravel sent a ripple of tension through the air. Maddox Reeves sat on his porch, his boots kicked up on an old wooden crate sipping coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He didn't move, didn't blink. His pit bulls lounging in the shade lifted their heads in unison, their eyes locking onto the intruders like well-trained snipers. The front gate swung open, and 3 men in cheap navy blue uniforms strutted up the driveway like they owned the place. Their clipboards and fake badges might have fooled some poor old retiree down the street, but Maddox had seen real authority before. These guys were playing dress-up. The tallest one, a pasty-faced man with a gut that said he enjoyed HOA meetings more than gym memberships, cleared his throat. "Sir, this property is in violation of several HOA regulations. You have 48 hours to vacate before we begin legal proceedings." His voice carried the manufactured confidence of a scammer who had never been punched in the face before. Maddox took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving them. "That's so." The second guy, shorter with an unfortunate mustache that made him look like a rejected police academy recruit, stepped forward. "According to our records, your residence is not compliant with community aesthetic. That includes the fence, the lawn, and those," he gestured toward Maddox's pit bulls, aggressive animals. Maddox's grip tightened around his mug. The dogs, as if sensing the insult, let out a low synchronized growl. Titan, his biggest, a muscular beast with a scarred ear, bared his teeth. Maddox set the mug down on the crate beside him. "You do realize," he said, voice even, "that my house isn't in an HOA, right?" The third man, who had been silent so far, gave a smarmy smile. "Not yet, but the neighborhood is transitioning. We're bringing order to this community. You'll want to cooperate. Things can get difficult for non-compliant homeowners." Just then, the screen door creaked open behind Maddox. A woman in her early 40s stepped out, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her eyes sharp and calculating. She wore faded jeans and a sheriff's department t-shirt that had seen better days. "Everything okay out here, Max?" she asked, her voice deceptively casual as she positioned herself slightly behind Maddox's chair. The tallest man's eyes flickered nervously to her shirt. Maddox felt a small smile tug at his lips. "Just fine, Alina. These gentlemen were explaining how I apparently live in an HOA I never signed up for." Alina DeSantos, his former partner from their days in private security, current deputy sheriff of Ridgemont County, and the only person besides himself who knew what was buried in his backyard, crossed her arms and leaned against the porch railing. Maddox let the silence stretch between them, the heat pressed down, the air thick with tension. Brutus, his oldest pit bull, stood up and padded over to Maddox's side, his head level with the seated man's knee. Maddox scratched behind the dog's ear, his fingers brushing over the old scars from his days as a rescue. "So let me get this straight," Maddox said finally. "You're telling me that despite the fact I own this property outright, I'm somehow under the rule of an HOA I never agreed to, and you expect me to just hand over my house?" "That's the best option," Mustache said with a condescending nod. Alina snorted. "And which development company are you boys fronting for this time? Westridge, or is it Pinnacle Estates now?" The 3 men exchanged quick glances. The tall one's face hardened. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern the sheriff's department. This is a civil matter." "Funny," Alina said, pulling out her phone, "because I've got about 6 complaints on my desk about men matching your descriptions running the exact same scam in Oakwood Hills." Maddox nodded slowly. Then, without warning, he let out a loud, sharp whistle. Instantly, all 4 pit bulls sprang to life in perfect synchronization. They launched from their positions, closing the distance between themselves and the intruders in a flash. Titan lunged at the tallest one, his massive frame stopping just inches from his knees, snarling. Rex and Havoc flanked Mustache, circling him like sharks, their teeth flashing. Brutus simply sat beside Maddox, watching, his presence alone enough to keep the last man frozen in place. The effect was immediate. The men stumbled back, their fake bravado crumbling. Tall guts sucked in a panicked breath. "Call them off." Maddox shrugged. "I didn't say attack. They're just standing their ground, kind of like me." One of the men tried to take a step back, and Havoc let out a warning bark that nearly sent him tumbling. All right, the leader raised his hands, clipboard shaking. We'll be back." Alina stepped forward, her stance shifting subtly to something more official. "No, you won't, unless you'd like me to bring you in for questioning about those complaints." Maddox chuckled, looking forward to it. The men practically tripped over each other in their rush back to their car, slamming the doors shut as the engine roared to life. Maddox stood, stretched, and whistled again. His dogs immediately returned to his side, tongues lolling, tails wagging as if the whole thing had just been a fun game. but Maddox wasn't smiling anymore. He watched as the car disappeared down the road, his gut telling him this wasn't over. Alina's face had turned serious too. Those weren't just random con artists, Max. They're working for someone with juice. I've been tracking these complaints for weeks, but every time I try to get authorization for an official investigation, the paperwork gets lost. Maddox raised an eyebrow. Inside job. Something's not right, she confirmed. Whatever's happening, it goes higher than some penny ante scam. He had faced threats before. He knew what real danger looked like. That night, long after the sun had set, Maddox sat in his darkened living room, watching the security feed on his laptop. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. Alina had gone back to her shift, promising to return in the morning with whatever information she could dig up unofficially. And sure enough, just past midnight, a shadow moved at the edge of the property. A figure in dark clothing crouched near the fence, a pair of bolt cutters in hand. Maddox leaned forward, his fingers grazing the loaded shotgun resting against the couch. He smiled. The HOA might think they owned this neighborhood, but they were about to learn this wasn't their territory. This was pit bull country. Maddox had been in enough fights to know when someone was testing the waters. The fake HOA enforcers had retreated, but not because they were scared off. No, men like that didn't back down after a single failure. They regrouped, they recalculated, they found another way to push their scam forward. That was why Maddox wasn't sleeping when the trouble came back. He sat in his dimly lit living room, one hand resting on the shotgun across his lap, the other clicking through the security feeds on his laptop. His pit bulls were curled up on the floor beside him, their ears twitching at every subtle noise. They could feel it too. The air had shifted, thick with the kind of tension that always came before a storm. At exactly 3:00 a.m., the cameras picked up movement. Two figures crept along the side of the fence, their silhouettes barely visible in the darkness. Maddox didn't move, he just watched. The men thought they were being clever, keeping low, staying quiet. They didn't realize the ground they were walking on was already a battlefield. One of them pulled out a pair of bolt cutters, lining up the blades against the chain-link fence. Maddox exhaled slowly. Amateurs, they didn't even know what they were about to step into. Before the bolt cutters could make their first squeeze, the motion lights in the yard snapped on, bathing the intruders in an unforgiving white glow. They flinched, momentarily blinded, and that was all the time Maddox needed. He let out a sharp whistle. The dogs were already moving before the sound had fully left his lips. Titan was the first to reach the fence, his deep, guttural bark cutting through the silence like a gunshot. The man with the bolt cutters jumped so hard he nearly dropped them. Rex and Havoc followed, snarling, their paws pounding against the dirt. The second intruder tried to run, but his foot caught on something unseen, sending him sprawling face first into the ground. Maddox stepped outside, the shotgun resting casually in the crook of his arm. You boys lost. The first guy tried to play tough, straightening his spine as he lifted the bolt cutters. You got no right keeping us from HOA property. Maddox tilted his head, amused. HOA property, huh? Pretty sure this fence is mine, just like the land, just like everything else you're standing on. The second man, still on the ground, was wheezing, struggling to push himself up. That was when Maddox noticed what had tripped him, a long, thick garden hose carefully positioned in the grass. He smirked. Guess his sloppy coiling had paid off. Titan took a slow, menacing step forward, his muscles rippling beneath his coat. The first guy's confidence cracked. All right, man, look, no need for this to get ugly. We just wanted to give you a final warning. 48 hours, remember. Maddox didn't move, and if I don't. The man hesitated. He had an answer, but he was too much of a coward to say it out loud. Maddox had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who knew they had power as long as no one called their bluff. Maddox had spent his life around men like that, in war zones and boardrooms alike. They puffed up their chests, they threw out threats, but the moment you pushed back, they withered. Maddox stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. The intruder took an involuntary step back. Titan barked once, sharp and commanding, and the guy flinched so hard it was embarrassing. Maddox sighed. Let me explain something to you. I don't run, I don't negotiate with clowns playing dress up, and I sure as hell don't scare easy. If you're going to come after me, you better come harder than this. The guy swallowed, glanced at his partner still struggling on the ground, and then made the smart choice. He turned and ran. The other man scrambled after him, tripped once more before finally making it over the fence. Maddox watched them go, shaking his head. He looked down at his dogs, who were still alert, waiting for his command. That was pathetic, he muttered. Titan wagged his tail. Havoc sneezed. Maddox turned back toward the house, but the moment he stepped onto the porch, a thought hit him. These guys weren't just making empty threats. They had a reason for targeting him. No scam artist put in this much effort unless there was real money on the table. And that meant one thing: this wasn't just about his house. It was about a bigger operation. His phone buzzed in his pocket. "Alina, tell me you're awake," she said when he answered. "Just had visitors," he replied. "They're moving fast," she said, her voice tense. "I just pulled the property records for your whole street. Every house that's been transitioned in the last 6 months was bought by shell companies that trace back to Councilman Warren Blake." Maddox's jaw tightened. Blake, the man who tried to have him and Alina fired from security work after they caught his son dealing drugs at a high-profile event 5 years ago. The man who told Maddox he'd regret crossing him someday. "There's more," Alina continued. "There's a city council vote next month on rezoning this whole area for commercial development, a luxury resort worth millions." Maddox walked inside, pulled up his laptop, and started digging. The fake HOA had to be leaving a paper trail somewhere, and sure enough, after half an hour of searching, he found it. The group had been running a scam in different neighborhoods for months. They would forge HOA documents, send fake legal notices, and trick homeowners into thinking they were legally obligated to leave. Once the properties were empty, they sold them to developers for a profit. It was a classic con, and it had worked on plenty of people. But Maddox wasn't just another victim. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. They were coming back. He could feel it. This wasn't just some random attempt to scare him. They had a plan, and they thought he was just another clueless homeowner who would fold under pressure. That was their biggest mistake. Maddox cracked his knuckles and smiled. They weren't ready for what was coming next. Maddox knew they'd be back. He didn't know when, but he knew it wouldn't be long. The scam only worked if they kept the pressure on, kept the intimidation rolling until the target either gave up or cracked. But Maddox Reeves wasn't built for breaking. He'd spent too much time in places where real threats existed, where the dangers weren't middle-aged men in polo shirts pretending to be law enforcement. These guys thought they were predators. They didn't realize they had wandered into a den of wolves. Maddox knew that Blake wouldn't just give up either. Not with millions at stake, not with his reputation on the line, not with his long-held grudge against Maddox. Alina arrived just after dawn, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept. "I pulled some strings," she said, dropping a thick folder on his kitchen table. "Blake's got 6 of the 8 council votes he needs for the rezoning locked down. Your street is the last piece of the puzzle. Once he controls enough properties, it's a done deal." "How much time do we have?" "The vote's in 3 weeks," she said, "but Blake's pushing to move it up. He knows I'm digging." Maddox nodded. "Then we dig faster." He spent the next day making sure everything was ready. He reinforced the locks, checked the security cameras, and walked the perimeter with his dogs. Titan, Havoc, Rex, and Brutus moved in formation beside him, sniffing the air, picking up scents Maddox couldn't detect. They knew something was coming too. They could sense it the way animals always did, a primal instinct that had kept their kind alive for thousands of years. Alina had taken the day off, officially to handle personal matters, but in reality, to help Maddox prepare. She'd brought blueprints of the neighborhood, satellite images of Blake's other properties, and files on the fake HOA enforcers they'd identified. "These guys aren't just scammers," Alina said, pointing to mugshots. "They're muscle for hire, ex-cons. The tall one's done time for aggravated assault, the mustache guy for armed robbery." Maddox wasn't surprised. Blake's getting desperate. "He's not the only one," Alina muttered. "My captain called me in this morning, told me to drop this personal vendetta against a respected community leader. Someone's got to him." By nightfall, Maddox was back on his porch, shotgun resting across his lap, sipping on a fresh cup of coffee. He wasn't tired. Years of training had taught him how to function on little to no sleep. His body was at rest, but his mind was sharp, scanning the darkness, waiting for the inevitable. Then, just past midnight, the first SUV rolled up. Maddox didn't move, didn't react. He simply watched as the vehicle came to a slow stop at the end of his driveway. The engine idled for a moment, then 2 more SUVs pulled up behind it. This wasn't some half-baked scare tactic anymore. This was an operation. The doors opened, 5 men stepped out. This time they weren't wearing fake uniforms. They were in dark clothing, the kind that blended into the night. One of them had a crowbar in hand. Another had a thick duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Maddox could guess what was inside, probably tools to cut through his locks, maybe even weapons in case things got rough. He let them make the first move. They approached the house cautiously, spreading out like they'd done this before. Maddox stayed where he was, calm, watching. Then, as one of them reached the front porch steps, he whistled. The reaction was immediate. Titan burst from the darkness, a blur of muscle and teeth. The man with the crowbar barely had time to register what was happening before the dog crashed into him, knocking him flat on his back. He screamed, trying to shove the pit bull off, but Titan wasn't letting up. He snapped his jaws just inches from the man's face, making it very clear he could end this whenever he wanted. The others hesitated, startled by the sudden attack. Then, from the side yard, Rex and Havoc came charging in. Panic broke out. One of the men spun to run, only to trip over a loose stone in the driveway, his arms flailing as he crashed to the ground. Havoc was on him in an instant, pinning him down with one massive paw. Another guy made the mistake of reaching for his bag, probably thinking he could grab something useful from it. Maddox didn't give him the chance. He stood up slowly, raising the shotgun just enough for them to see. "Go ahead," he said, "try it." The man froze, eyes darting between Maddox and the barrel of the gun. The one guy who hadn't been taken down yet, probably the leader, lifted his hands, palms out. "All right, let's all take a breath here." Maddox exhaled sharply through his nose. "Funny, that's what I was about to say when you idiots rolled up to my house in the middle of the night with a crowbar." The leader tried to smile, but it came out nervous. "Look, there's been a misunderstanding." Maddox nodded toward the men pinned under his dogs. "Yeah, seems like it. You all misunderstood what was going to happen if you stepped onto my property again." The guy's fingers twitched. He was thinking about running. Maddox shook his head. "Bad idea," he said. Then, just to drive the point home, Brutus stepped out from the shadows, his deep growl vibrating through the air. He was the calmest of the pack, the one who didn't waste energy barking or lunging. He didn't need to. He was the executioner. The leader's face went pale. Okay, just let them go. We'll leave." Maddox tilted his head, considering. Then, from down the road, the sound of sirens filled the air. The leader's eyes widened. He turned back to Maddox. "You called the cops?" Maddox smirked. "You think I'd go through all this trouble and not?" "Not exactly," came a voice from the darkness. Alina stepped into view, her service weapon drawn, badge glinting in the moonlight. "He didn't need to call. I was already here." The man cursed under his breath, but he knew it was over. The flashing blue and red lights cast long shadows across the yard as the police cars screeched to a stop. Officers jumped out, guns raised, shouting commands. But as the scene unfolded, a black sedan pulled up behind the police cars. The back door opened, and a tall, distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit stepped out. Councilman Warren Blake. He surveyed the scene with cold eyes before walking straight toward the house, ignoring the officer's warnings to stay back. "Reeves," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Call off this circus. You're embarrassing yourself." "Maddox didn't move," says the man whose hired goons just got taken down by a pack of rescue dogs. Blake's face darkened. "You think this ends here? I own half the police department. I own the judges. This is happening with or without your cooperation." Alina stepped forward, positioning herself between Blake and Maddox. "Not tonight it isn't, Councilman, and not without going through proper channels." Blake smiled, a cold, calculating expression. "Deputy DeSantos, always the idealist. I heard you've been asking questions, digging into things that don't concern you. That's a dangerous habit in this town." "Is that a threat?" Alina's hand didn't waver from her weapon. "It's a reality check," Blake gestured around them. "Look at this neighborhood. Rundown houses, overgrown lots. In a year, this will be a luxury destination bringing jobs and revenue to our community. Progress happens whether stubborn holdouts like Reeves accept it or not." "Funny definition of progress," Maddox said, "using ex-cons to terrorize homeowners." "I have no idea what you're talking about." Blake straightened his tie. "I'm a public servant working for the greater good." "Save it for the press," Alina cut in. "We have enough to start an official investigation now." Blake laughed. "Do you? Because all I see is a homeowner sicking dangerous animals on innocent men. In fact," he pulled out his phone, "I'm calling animal control right now. Those beasts are a public menace." Maddox felt something cold settle in his chest. The dogs, Blake knew exactly where to hit him. But before he could respond, another car pulled up. This one wasn't a police vehicle or one of Blake's SUVs. It was a news van, the logo of the local station emblazoned on its side. A young woman jumped out, camera operator in tow. "Councilman Blake," she called out. "Melissa Chen, Channel 8 News. Care to comment on why you're at the scene of an apparent home invasion at 1 a.m., or perhaps on the documents we received showing your connection to fraudulent property acquisitions across the county?" Blake's composed facade cracked. "What? Who sent you those?" "Anonymous source," the reporter said, her camera operator already filming. "Along with some very interesting recordings of conversations between you and these men currently being arrested." Maddox didn't move, didn't react. He simply watched as Blake's plans crumbled in real time, the councilman's face cycling through shock, rage, and finally, barely contained panic. Alina stepped closer to Maddox. "Anonymous source, huh?" she whispered. "I might have sent a few emails before sunset," Maddox replied quietly. Amazing what people will do when they discover they've been scammed out of their homes. The scene devolved into chaos, Blake shouting about defamation, the reporter pressing for comments, police officers trying to maintain order while processing the arrested men. Through it all, Maddox stood on his porch, his dogs now sitting calmly at his feet, watching as justice unfolded in its messy, imperfect way. One of the officers, a guy Maddox knew from town, walked up to him, shaking his head. "You really couldn't just call us first?" Maddox shrugged, had to make sure they got the proper welcome. The cop glanced at the pit bulls, who were all sitting obediently now, their tongues hanging out like they hadn't just taken down a gang of home-invading scammers. "You trained them yourself?" the officer asked. Maddox nodded. The cop let out a low whistle. "Damn, maybe you should start a business." Maddox smirked. "Maybe." Alina joined them, holstering her weapon. "Blake's threatening lawsuits, political retribution, the works, but with the evidence we've gathered and the press involvement, he's done. His rezoning plan is dead in the water." By the time the last of Blake's hired goons had been loaded into the police cars, the adrenaline was wearing off. Maddox scratched behind Titan's ears, feeling the familiar weight of his pack beside him. They had done their job. As the cars pulled away, he grabbed his coffee from the porch. It was cold again. He took a sip anyway. He turned to his dogs, shaking his head. "Boys, they just don't learn, do they?" Titan huffed, Rex wagged his tail, Havoc rolled onto his back, already over it. Alina leaned against the porch railing, fatigue finally showing on her face. "You know Blake won't be the last, right? There will always be someone else looking to make a quick buck off people who can't fight back." Maddox sighed, taking in the quiet night. "Then I guess it's good they've got us." Maybe now, finally, he'd get some sleep, but he doubted it. Not when there were still battles to be fought, still people who needed protecting, not when Pitbull country still needed its defenders.